Our second scripture today comes from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. He said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And then he said, "Well, there remains yet the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. Appearance is pretty critical in our culture. We make a lot of judgments by what we see, and we make them very quickly. Now, a few years ago, we had an experience of that made our whole family smile, at least the whole family that was aware of what was going on. We were visiting that land where football is religion and all people are true believers in Pittsburgh. And we were meeting a friend in this kind of trendy, hip section of the city called the Strip District. We were meeting a friend there, and we were going to have breakfast. And it's an urban northeast area, and so there's narrow sidewalks and lots of people on the sidewalks, lots going on in the Strip District. And we were walking down the sidewalk, and the crowds parted in front of us, like the Red Sea in front of Moses. John was walking in front of us. Now, John was oblivious because, when you look like John, people get out of your way. And so he really wasn't thinking, but the rest of us were watching, and we were watching the faces of each of these people as they kind of spread aside. Now remember, this is the land of football. This is where football is religion and all people are true believers. They could have been shouting it for as obvious as it was. Who does he play for? Is he the new nose guard that they're trying out for the Steelers? his size, his body type, the way he carries himself, all of that, in their minds, read defensive lineman, football player. It was so obvious that the rest of us laughed. We literally laughed over it. Did you see those? Did you see that? Now, looking at John, he can be intimidating. It doesn't surprise me that one of his jobs is as a bouncer. I imagine he walked into that little bar and he said, "I'm looking for a job," and the owner went, until you know him. And he's a marshmallow. And you all know that. He's a marshmallow. There was a story when he was in high school and still wrestling, and he was a little bit smaller then. He was only wrestling at 275. And he had a match with this guy that he beat every time they wrestled. And he lost. And I went to him afterwards and I said, "John, what happened? Why did you lose?" And he said, "Well, he was having a really rough week, and he needed a win." That's the John we all know. That's the John we all know. That he's inside, he is kind and gentle, and generally he puts other people first, even when it would hurt him. I can't imagine what would have happened had his coach heard him saying that. It would have been ugly. It is clear that sometimes what is inside doesn't match what is outside. And as more often than not, when that's the case, what is inside is what's really, really important. God knew that. Samuel didn't. Samuel was the prophet, and he had heard God's voice speak to him and tell him that Saul is no longer God's chosen king. Well, that was scary enough in and of itself. But then God speaks and says, "Now, Samuel, I want you to go and I want you to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the next king." Samuel expected the ultimate warrior. He pictured in his mind some Hercules-like character who would lead the armies of Israel into battle and destroy all of their enemies. He pictured someone who could take the place of Saul. Now, if we read a little bit before this and learned a little bit more about Saul, that becomes a pretty scary prospect. Saul was a huge man. We're told that he stood a full head taller than anyone else in all of Israel. He met every stereotype that you could have of an ancient warrior king. And he didn't get there because he was born into it. He was chosen by God as the specimen of what a man's man was supposed to be. He was an alpha male, if ever there had been an alpha male. And so, when Samuel gets told he's to go and anoint someone else's king, he pictures more. He pictures more. He sees someone who's even bigger than Saul, if he could imagine that. Someone who's stronger. Someone who's got more skill with a sword. Someone whose ability to strategize is more sharply tuned. Someone who is wise enough to know how to put all of those issues that happen in government together and make good things happen. More of everything that a king is supposed to be. He pictured in his mind a man to whom people would bow instinctively. A man that when he walked down the sidewalk, it would part like the Red Sea in front of Moses. He pictured a man who would be so impressive that when others saw him, they would cower. And so he goes to Bethlehem and he has Jesse there, and it's not clear, but you get the sense that he's told Jesse what's going on here. And I can imagine that Jesse's thinking, wow, I guess I better send the biggest, strongest, most handsome, most everything. And so out comes his first son, Eliab. Now, Samuel looks at him and he's not quite as big as Saul. But, he's muscular and he's handsome and he's got this way of carrying himself that says, I'm confident. And he says, well, maybe that's it. And he starts to pull out his little horn of oil to anoint Eliab. And God says, no, that's not him. What? Okay. Maybe Jesse didn't bring out the best one first. Jesse, this isn't the right one. Send out the next one. And this happens through 7 sons. And with each one, Samuel becomes a little bit more confused. God, they're getting smaller. They're not quite as handsome. This last one, I don't know about him. I was glad you didn't pick him. But they're all gone. That's it. All 7 of them. And so Samuel turns to Jesse and he says, do you have another one? He says, well, yeah. He's just the runt. He's out there taking care of the sheep. Okay, I'll get him if you really want me to. And so they send for this boy. Fair-skinned, a little bit sunburned perhaps, never done battle, the least likely candidate of all. Even his own father hadn't bothered to call him in. And this boy is the one who's chosen by God. Now, we know the rest of the story. We know that David was not a perfect king, and he certainly was not a perfect man. He used his power selfishly at times. He was guilty of adultery and murder. He had hands that were stained with blood of war. But God still used him. He expanded Israel's border and he furthered the faith of God's people. Through either his own writing or commissioning others to write Psalms, David touches our faith even still by giving voice to our deepest feelings of praise, of fear, of despair, of joy. And he gives picture to our deepest brokenness and our most profound hope of redemption. David was the least likely candidate. He had the fewest requirements for the job from anything anyone could see. He was the last one that Samuel would have picked. He was the last one that his father would have picked. He was the last one that you and I, knowing the rest of the story, would have picked. Indeed, if David was running for office today, he couldn't get elected as dog catcher. And you know it. You know it. But God chose him. God chose this skinny little boy, skinny teenager probably, and loosed the very power of God in his life. We look back and we see this terribly flawed leader. But God sees that in spite of those flaws, one who would play a significant role in the history of salvation. Sometimes we don't see everything that's there. And sometimes when we see those wrong things, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. You've all had that experience, haven't you? I remember watching my kids as they would struggle with some area in their academic life and say, why bother to study this? I'm never going to get it. And of course, if they didn't study it, they didn't get it and fulfilled the prophecy. I won't get offered this job, so why in the world should I really put myself out there and give a good interview? And so I blow the interview and don't get the job. I'm not worth loving, and so I act unlovable. And guess what? Nobody gets past that. My gifts are unimportant, and so I don't give them. And they literally become unimportant. A dying church uses all of its resources just to keep its doors open. And of course, when it does that, the doors end up closing anyway. A nation abandons its deepest commitments to its most wonderful vision of what it is and can be in order to protect itself and finds there's nothing left worth protecting. It's easy to make judgments from these outside appearances and to miss what is really there. What do you see when you look at yourself? Do you see your wooden legs, your warts, your inadequacies, your blemishes, and your failures? Or do you see what God sees? Do you see a man or a woman who is immensely gifted, filled with potential, ready to play hers or his part in changing the world and making it a better place? What do you see when you look at this church? Do you see a little church with overworked volunteers, programs without very much flash, way too much gray hair, surrounded by needs too big to address? Or do you see what God sees? Do you see a scrappy little congregation that wrestles with the needs because it cares? A congregation that lives and walks the good news of the gospel, that shares its gifts and its talents, and its compassion pours out into the world, both locally and around the world. A little congregation that somehow sees that it has a role in changing the world. Samuel didn't see what God could see. I imagine as each son went by and he got more and more confused, he just had this thing in his mind and he said, you know what, God, I give up. You tell me when it's the right one and I'll put the oil on him and we'll all be done, because I don't see what you're up to. I don't see it. And so he stepped aside and God's vision held sway. Flawed as he is, all these thousands of years later, we still know who David is and what he did. And we benefit from that in spite of his very, very real humanity. And so the call to us today is to open our eyes, to grab a hold of God's vision, to see what God sees, as wondrous as that is. And if that's too much to ask, if it's too much for you or me to really see what God sees, if it's too much for me to look in the mirror and say, wow, that's one that God has chosen to use. If it's too much for me to look at this congregation and say, yes, we are a critical part of God's yearnings for this community and for this world. If that's too much, at least then let us step aside and say, God, I don't see it. I don't understand. But you're God, so you do what you're going to do. And we'll follow along behind.